thank you for that. I feel very seen by that talk. Our next part of the British Eyrie is Deborah Hyde, speaking on the Beast of Croglin Grange. Deborah is a makeup artist and the editor of the Skeptic magazine. You're not? What? You're a special effects artist, aren't you? No. Forget that bit. I'm really fluffing these today. Sorry, everyone. You're a prosthetics technician? No. Okay, I'm going to give up now. Totally giving up now. I think Deborah Hyde, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, you got it running? There we go. Are we getting...
It will go up in just a second.
Okay. It's not on slideshow view. Hello. There we go. Okay. No, I'm not a makeup artist. I'm not a prosthetic technician. They are very, very skilled people. I would love to be that skilled. I'm not. I count the money. I'm basically a producer. I do all of the boring businessy stuff. But I do edit the Skeptic magazine as well. And I'm at Your Domain on Twitter, so please do follow me. It's lovely to get some feedback from you. You'll see the name up there. There we go. At Your Domain, please do follow me on Twitter. I find it's not so carnivorous if you ignore all of the idiots on it. Editor of the Skeptic magazine, as I said, and today we're going to be talking about Croglin. It's a place near Carlisle, just a little bit south of the Scottish border. It's very well established, been there for a long time. The name probably comes from Middle or Old English, a bend in the torrent or river, something like that. So you can see that it's been there a long time. And it is the centre of a vampire legend in England, which is very peculiar because we don't really get vampires. This is the illustration that you are legally obliged to use. It's the only picture that we actually have of the Croglin Grandpa. The Croglin Grandpa. The Croglin vampire, and it was by an artist called Les Edwards. They never actually used it for a specific Croglin book, but they did use it for two others, fortunately, so it did see the light of day commercially. And we have the story from Augustus Hare, who went around collecting very, very tedious stories about all the posh people he knew. And somebody from the New York Times pointed out that his ghost stories were infinitely more interesting. Luckily, he did collect those as well. He was at dinner once with Henry Liddell, Earl of Ravensworth, and another man named Captain Edward Fisher Roe. Now, Captain Edward Fisher Roe told him a story. He had a very long-established family, and they had a place called Croglin Grange in the north. And he told him a very peculiar and horrific story based there. Basically, I'll take excerpts from the Hare story rather than recounting the whole thing. He said, the Fisher family have possessed a very curious old place, Croglin Grange. It was 1 story high, but it has a terrace from which large grounds sweep away towards the church in the hollow and a fine distant view. Their tenants were 2 brothers and a sister. They heard their praises from all quarters, and the tenants were very greatly delighted with their new residence. In every respect, Croglin Grange was exactly suited to them. So they weren't people who were trying to get out of their tenancy agreement at all. This happened after Hare intuited after Fisher had moved from Croglin. He was clearly a total party animal because the whole family moved to Guildford. I mean, you laugh, but I hear there's a really good Pizza Express in Woking. So they wanted to really emphasise that their tenants were very happy where they were. These 3 people, 3 siblings, separated from the night, all retiring to their rooms on the ground floor. The sister didn't close the shutters, so she closed the window but not the shutters. It had been a really hot day. Gradually, she became aware of 2 lights which flickered in and out in the belt of trees which separated the lawn from the churchyard, fixed in a dark substance, a definite, ghastly something, increasing in size and substance as it approached. The most uncontrollable horror seized her. The door was close to the window, and the door was locked on the inside, and while she was unlocking it, she must for an instant be closer to it. Her voice seemed paralysed, her tongue glued to the roof of her mouth. So she conforms very much to a Gothic heroine there, sort of, swooning and being silent as she was attacked. She heard a scratch, scratch, scratch upon the window and saw a hideous brown face with flaming eyes glaring in at her. She became aware that the creature was unpicking the lead. A diamond pane of glass fell into the room. Then a long bony finger of the creature came in and turned the handle of the window, and the window opened. It came up to the bed and twisted its long, bony fingers onto her hair, and it dragged her head over the side of the bed, and it bit her violently in the throat. So far, so hammer. She was a very rational woman. She decided that it had been some kind of escaped lunatic, and that there was no reason to just disappear from a house that, after all, they had a tenancy for 7 years. They took her to Switzerland for the winter, but she recovered. And the one brother pursued the creature. It fled before him through the moonlight with gigantic strides and eventually seemed to disappear over the wall into the churchyard. As I said, she thought that there was a rational explanation. So they went to Switzerland for the winter, but they came back to resume their tenancy the next year. In March, again, scratch, scratch, scratch upon the window, and the same hideous brown shriveled face with glaring eyes. She screamed, her brothers came in, and one of the brothers fired and hit this thing in the leg. It scrambled into the churchyard and disappeared into a vault which belonged to a family long extinct. The next day, they got all of the villagers together so that everybody could witness this. The vault was full of coffins. They'd been broken open and their contents, horribly mangled and distorted, were scattered over the floor. One coffin alone remained intact, and of that the lid had been lifted but still lay loose upon the coffin. They raised it, and there, brown, withered, shriveled, mummified but quite entire, was the same hideous figure which had looked in at the windows of Croglin Grange, and the marks of a recent pistol shot in the leg. That's actually not that unusual. Sympathetic wounding and metamorphosis is a very key theme with witches and with werewolves, that you injure the animal, the creature, and then later on you go and it's the proof that you've got the actual thing, because it bears the wound that you initially inflicted on whatever horrible thing it was that was running away. And so they did the only thing that can lay a vampire, they burnt it. Well, now for me that's a really interesting term, because he's using the V word, and we don't really have vampires, particularly in the folklore of Britain. We have some revenants. Revenants are usually associated with unfinished business, with unsettled times, with disease, with immorality. There are lots of various stories from people like William of Newbury or Walter Map. They tend to be written during the time of what was later called the Anarchy. It was when there was a breakdown in civil order, when William of Blois and Queen Matilda were fighting to see who would win the crown. So it could be seen as being metaphorical, as being informative of the state of the country at the time. They didn't have vampires in the way that we have them, the Bela Lugosi type vampires. In fact, the vampire really belongs to Eastern Europe in the early 18th century. Vampires weren't invented in the 18th century. They probably were a feature of religious life in the lands that supported them for many centuries prior to that. You can see there, that's a map of the religious influences just after the Reformation, but really this does apply to later too. In the East, there was a relative amount of religious freedom. You could be Muslim, you could be Protestant, you could be Eastern Orthodox. The only thing that you couldn't be was Catholic, because Western Europe was ruled pretty much in broad strokes by the Catholic Habsburgs, and then the places where the Ottomans ruled, they didn't want that kind of influence there. So if you take all of these influences plus a little bit of paganism, then you come up with the idea that a body can survive after death, animated by some kind of a spirit that is demonic or has unfinished business or something like that. The folklore was very active and alive around there, and it was the news of what was going on that came from the Habsburg Empire in the 1730s that reached Western Europe, which gave us the vampires that we recognised. Basically, all of the frontiers moved eastwards. The local civil servants had to administer a people and their peculiar religious practices that they had never encountered before. So peasants who would go to stop people coming back from the dead by sticking them in their graves, by piercing their hearts with stakes or something like that, that was sacrilegious to the Catholics. They were appalled. As a result, these lurid stories made their way eastwards, and that is when the vampire hits Western Europe in a big way. In fact, vampirism is reckoned these days really to be a folk manifestation, a misunderstanding of epidemic death and decomposition. People didn't keep bodies around for the very good reason that they're a health hazard. You don't want to watch your nearest and dearest decompose. So, well, maybe some of you do. But really, decomposition doesn't necessarily work in the linear way that we might expect. People, if they dug someone up 6 months later, might misunderstand and feel that the corpse showed manifestations of life even after death. That's where the vampire idea comes from. So the next visit that we get of the Beast of Croglin Grange comes from Charles Harper in his book Haunted Houses. He pointed out that it is to be added from personal observation that there is no place styled Croglin Grange. Croglin is a little village, very tiny village actually. There are Croglin High Hall and Croglin Low Hall, somewhat distant. They're both farmhouses, very much like one another, and not in any particular resembling the description given. So that's peculiar. He actually did a drawing of Croglin Low Hall. It still exists. And he points out that it's probably the house indicated from the story, but is at least a mile distant from the church, which has been rebuilt. The churchyard contains no tomb, which by any stretch of the imagination could be identified with that described by Mr. Hare. And in fact, we've got a picture here of Croglin Church. This is a 19th century version of the church, but there were previous ones established, a Norman church and a Saxon church. So it's long been a sacred site. You could say that perhaps any remnants of this vault which housed this vampire have been since removed. But it was built in, I think it was 1858, somewhere around there. So really, this should have been commensurate with Augustus Hare's story. We can see that it's been established for a very long time because of the incumbents that were there, including Mr. You can see the very Reverend John de Wetwang there. Oh, you people sicken me, you really do. And also George Sanderson of 1671, and we're going to go back to him later on. He's interesting. You can see it as an aerial picture of this church, and I'm going to repeat what Augustus Hare said. He said, "It has a terrace from which large grounds sweep away towards the church in the hollow and a fine distant view. This church simply doesn't conform to the description of Augustus Hare's beast experience." In fact, we can see from ancient maps, this one from Saxton and this one from Jansen, that we've got the main settlement of Croglin at the top there, and what Jansen calls Little Croglin, and what Saxton called Croglin Parva. So this has been long established. You quite often get this with British towns, is that the magna, it's just Latin for big, basically, that you get the main town at Croglin Magna, and then you get a little settlement, the same settlement, but distant, probably served by the same clergyman, is Parva, which just means small. Montague Summers, well-known nutcase, also had plenty to say about this. Montague Summers was very good at collecting information from books, but he was astonishingly gullible. But he had the sense in this particular book to put the story of Croglin Grange right next to the story of Varney the Vampire. Do we all know about Varney the Vampire here? Yeah, who's heard? Yeah, of course, yeah. Varney the Vampire was a penny dreadful. And in an absolute classic case of perverse incentives, the writer was paid by the word. as a result of which he didn't suffer from brevity. So just to give you an example, the Bible is 783,000 words. Varney is 667,000, but not quite as interesting. So, but it is deeply purple, and it's one of those things that you just read for the hell of it. I mean, it is hilarious. This part I find very interesting. A tall figure standing on the ledge immediately outside the long window, its fingernails upon the glass. The patterning and clattering of the nails continue, long nails that appear as if the growth for many years have been untouched. By the way, you should be really grateful for the editing I've done on this, because the original version is about 5 times as flipping long. She tries to scream, but a choking sensation comes over her, and she cannot. A small pane of glass is broken. Oh, thank you. Lovely. A small pane of glass is broken, and from without introduces a long, gaunt hand which seems utterly destitute of flesh. The fastening is removed. She drew her breath short and thick. Her bosom heaves, her limbs tremble, yet she cannot withdraw her eyes. Half on the bed and half off it, her long hair streams across the entire width of the bed. The figure seizes the long tresses of her hair, and twining them around his bony hands, he held her to the bed. Then with a plunge, he seizes her neck into his fang-like teeth. So this conforms really very closely to the story that we hear from Augustus Hare. And it is actually a little bit more of a classic vampire story, and it is set at the right time. Varney the Vampire is set in kind of 1730s Europe, when the real vampire stories were making their way over to us. So we've got this kind of Victorian sublimation. You can't state sexual themes particularly clearly. It has to be sort of very allegorical. So you've got, as unfortunately I said on daytime TV once, that you've got authorised penetration. So they didn't invite me back. Summers did point out, though, for as gullible as he was, that Charles C. Harper, in his interesting if somewhat sceptical study, Haunted Houses, this criticism does not seem to affect the story in the slightest. Okay. The vault, since the family would long be extinct, would have been obliterated. Such a precaution would be obvious after the fearful attack of the vampire and would not be a difficult business. So he feels that there is still quite a possibility that there was a real vampire at Croglin. F. Clive Ross, in a very obscure magazine, actually found out, he went up there, he did some research around the area, and he found that Croglin Low Hall actually was called Croglin Grange, and it changed its name in the early 18th century. So that's interesting. Another bit of proof that Croglin Low Hall was probably the candidate. It was single story, it's now double story, but he found corbels that would have supported actually a roof at the single story level. So it seems to have been added on to later. And there was an adjacent church that had been demolished during the English Civil War. So all of a sudden it looks more like Croglin Low Hall is the proper candidate, because Croglin Main Church doesn't seem to fit from all of the details that we have. Historic England actually confirms this. It goes through the building in quite a bit of detail. And it says that the nearby chapel belonging to the house was demolished in the 19th century. So they disagree about when it was demolished, but they both do agree that there was a chapel which probably served the local posh people, the people at the Low Hall and the High Hall. Here's a picture that I got from Lionel and Patricia Fanthorpe's book. This is a modern, well, within the last sort of half century picture of Croglin Low Hall. And there was a picture there you see of that window there is allegedly the one through which the vampire came. And a more recent photograph, which somebody was kind enough to provide over the internet for me, Mark Fowler, he'd visited, and he notices that it's been bricked up and there are all sorts of horseshoes over it. So somebody's still a bit superstitious about this kind of thing. Mark Alexander pointed out that there's sort of a document through a document with a letter that there was apparently the daughter of a Reverend Joseph Ireland had been attacked by some kind of creature, and it was in the form of a bat. Really peculiar kind of a motif for England 5 centuries ago, a very understandable motif for Victorian horror. And this bat was injured in the same way that the Croglin beast was injured, and it returned to the tomb of George Sanderson. And we know that George Sanderson was a 17th century vicar at Croglin, so this is the second time his name has come up. There we can see him in the original list. Richard Whittington Egan pointed out that the Fisher Row family were tenants, not owners. And that it was possibly all part of a very well-established local legend. In fact, the 2 families who had previously owned the house were still in the area, the Towery family and one other. So if there was something that people had been talking about for a very long period of time, it was probably sort of still in the ether, in effect. Jeff Holder does a really, really good roundup of all of this stuff. He says that between 1874 and 1900, many works on Cumbrian folklore and history had been published, and none of them mentioned the story. It's a fair enough point. These kinds of things do tend to live. They tend to live for a long time orally, and then they're captured by somebody for literary purposes. But for all of this folklore to be collected and for nobody to mention it does seem very peculiar. He calls the 50s the period of invention. This was when the story ended up becoming combined with a lot of very classic vampire stories. The girl became Amelia, her brothers, I think one of them was called Mike, a very unusual name for the 19th century. So it became embellished and drew in all sorts of influences from literary fiction. He reckoned, because we've gone from Hare assuming that this was happening before Captain Fisher had moved to Guildford. So we've got Hare assuming this all happened in the 1870s or so. Then we're pushing it back a little bit further to maybe the 1730s, to the kind of Varney type era. And then we're wondering about George Sanderson in 1671. Holder reckons that much of the collected traditions point to the origin in the 1680s or 90s. He says he wonders if he's actually looking at a distorted view of a 17th century religious dispute. During the Commonwealth, that was the period after they cut the king's head and then invited him off and then invited him to come back again, the Puritan regime imposed many ministers on parishes across the country. Such men were known as intruding vicars, and George Sanderson was one such. In 1671, a new monarchy supporting the Church of England vicar, he got a job at Croglin and Kirkoswald, remaining as rector of Croglin until his death in 1691. So in other words, he had been one of these vicars that had been pushed onto the local people, probably against their will, probably wasn't liked very much, and then when his job was at stake, he just turned his colours and became a mainstream Church of England vicar. Is it possible that some people in the Croglin area were displeased that the Reverend Sanderson had abjured his Puritan principles and replaced their former minister? Could this have led to some kind of rumour mill against the rector, a campaign that somehow became twisted into the vampire tale? Well, we're left back with Les Edwards' illustration of the Croglin vampire. I think that going through all of this, we can see that the details have changed through time, that there is no one ossified story which you go to one point to try and prove. I don't think we had a vampire in England. In fact, I don't think there were any vampires in Bulgaria either, but that's just me. I think that what this story shows is that even though the vampire as a specific folkloric type of theme isn't really at home in the chilly northwestern part of Europe that we live in, that actually revenants are, that we had enough to build on, and that organically this story has developed over a period of time. It has and chasing it down through its various eras and various manifestations means that we can show it is actually real folklore. It doesn't appear pristine like a piece of literary work. It builds on itself and is created with the retelling. So in that way, perhaps the Beast of Croglin Grange is a vampire after all. Thank you very much.